Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a concept that might seem pretty straightforward at first glance.
Yeah.
But trust me, it gets super complicated once you start digging deeper. We're talking about fitness. Survival of the fittest, all that jazz.
Ah, yes, fitness. That seemingly simple idea, that's actually a philosophical rabbit hole.
Exactly. And to guide us down this rabbit hole, we're going to be taking a close look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on fitness. Get ready for some serious brain flexing.
I'm ready, let's jump in.
All right, so let's start with that famous phrase, survival of the fittest. It rolls off the tongue, right? But when you stop to think about it, what does fittest really mean?
Right, it seems obvious until you try to define it.
Yeah, like if we say fittest just means the ones who reproduce the most,
Yeah,
doesn't that just make the whole idea circular?
you've hit the nail on the head. That's the classic problem with defining fitness. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually quotes C.H. Waddington, a biologist, who said that the fittest individuals are simply the most effective in leaving gametes to the next generation.
Okay, so not very helpful. That's just saying the fittest are the ones who, well, are the fittest. How do we get beyond that?
Well, one way to think about it is to look at what's called ecological fitness. Instead of just counting offspring, we consider how well an organism's traits actually match up with its environment.
I see. So it's not just about having babies, it's about how well you're suited to where you live and what you have to do to survive there.
Exactly. It's about solving the problems your environment throws at you. Think of it like a key fitting into a lock. The better the fit, the better that organism can survive and thrive.
That makes sense. But how do you even begin to measure ecological fitness? The environment is so complex, there are like a zillion different challenges an organism has to face.
That's one of the biggest issues with ecological fitness. It's hard to define exactly what makes an organism a good fit for its environment. It's a bit subjective, isn't it? And comparing the fit of a fish to the fit of, say, a cactus,
Mhm.
it's not exactly apples to apples.
Right. So I guess that's why a lot of biologists just stick to counting offspring. At least it's a number you can easily measure.
It's definitely tempting. But if we just focus on reproduction, do we miss those nuances of how an organism actually interacts with its environment?
Hmm. Good point. So how do we balance those two ideas?
Well, that brings us to another layer of the debate. Individual fitness versus trait fitness.
Okay, now we're getting fancy. What's the difference?
Individual fitness is all about how successful a single organism is. How long does it live? How many offspring does it produce? Stuff like that.
Okay, so it's a very individualistic perspective.
Yeah, you could say that. But then there's trait fitness, which looks at the average success of individuals who share a particular trait.
Ah, so it's more like a group perspective, like how advantageous is having this particular trait.
Exactly. The source mentions a researcher named Endler who showed how studying individual fitness can inform our understanding of trait fitness, and vice versa. They kind of go hand in hand.
That makes sense. An individual's traits obviously contribute to its success, which then affects how common that trait becomes in the population. It's all interconnected.
It is. But here's a mind-blowing thought. What if neither individual nor trait fitness is the real driver of evolution? What if, as the Stanford Encyclopedia suggests, trait fitness is more like an emergent property of the entire population?
Whoa, now that's getting philosophical. So you're saying that fitness isn't something an individual organism has. It's more like a characteristic of the entire population.
It's a radical idea, isn't it? It kind of takes the focus away from the individual and puts it on the collective.
Yeah, it's like saying that fitness is a description of a pattern we see at the population level, not necessarily a cause of that pattern. Wow, this deep dive is already making my head spin.
Buckle up, because we're about to dive into an even more mind-bending layer of the fitness puzzle, the idea of fitness as a probabilistic disposition.
Okay, I think I need a translator for that one.
Think about it like this. We say a glass is fragile even if it never actually breaks.
Right, it has the potential to break.
Exactly. It has a disposition towards breaking under certain conditions. Similarly, an organism can have a probabilistic disposition towards a certain level of reproductive success. It's not guaranteed, but it's a likelihood based on its traits and environment.
So it's not just about how many offspring you have. It's about the probability of having offspring based on all these different factors. It's like rolling a dice. You never know what you're going to get, but some numbers are more likely to come up than others.
That's a great analogy, and this perspective allows for the role of chance in evolution.
Right.
Not everything is predetermined.
I like that. It's like you might have all the right traits for success, but sometimes life just throws you a curveball.
Exactly. But how do we actually define and measure this probabilistic fitness?
Yeah, that sounds like a headache waiting to happen.
It is. One issue is that just looking at long-term trends over many generations doesn't always give you the full picture. Environments change, random events occur.
Right, so how do you factor in all that uncertainty? Is it like trying to solve a mystery where you're missing half the clues?
It can feel that way. Some philosophers even think there might be fundamental probabilities in biology, just like in quantum physics, that we may never fully grasp.
Oh boy, now we're talking quantum mechanics.
It gets deep, but the point is, it's a really complex issue.
So, have philosophers made any progress in defining fitness as a probability? Or are we still stuck in a philosophical quagmire?
There have been attempts, but they often run into counterexamples. The Stanford Encyclopedia highlights a promising equation developed by Pence and Ramsey that tries to account for long-term survival of lineages, not just single generations.
Ah, so they're trying to create a bigger picture of fitness, taking into account those long-term effects.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the immediate and considering the overall trajectory of a lineage over time. But the question remains, does their equation truly capture all the nuances of fitness, or is there still more to the story?
That's a question for the philosophers.
It is. But before we get too lost in equations, I think it's time to address a really fundamental assumption that's built into our understanding of fitness. The very idea of a biological individual.
Wait, are you saying we need to redefine what it means to be an individual?
Maybe not redefine, but at least expand our thinking. Our traditional focus on discrete organisms might be too limited. What about colonies, clonal organisms, symbionts?
Right, those are all situations where it's hard to say where one individual ends and another begins. Are we all just one big interconnected organism?
That's a question. But the point is, this blurring of boundaries between individuals has implications for how we think about fitness. If a colony, or even a multi-species community, is the true unit of selection, then reproductive success might not be the primary factor anymore.
Mind blown. So how do you even measure the fitness of something that doesn't reproduce in the traditional sense, like a colony of ants?
That's a question that's driving a lot of research and debate. And it leads us to some fascinating alternative ideas of fitness. For example, Levin Valen proposed thinking about fitness in terms of energy control.
Energy control. So it's not about how many babies you have, it's about how much energy you control.
Exactly. Who has the most resources? Who's at the top of the food chain, so to speak?
So it's like a power struggle rather than a baby-making contest.
You could say that. And then there's Frédéric Bouchard, who emphasized persistence through time as a measure of fitness.
Persistence. So like how long you can survive even if you don't have a ton of offspring. Those ancient bacteria that have been around for billions of years, they're the ultimate survivors.
Exactly. They might not be prolific reproducers, but they've found a way to endure.
It's like the tortoise and the hare, right? Slow and steady wins the race, at least in some cases.
Sometimes, absolutely. And it makes you realize that fitness isn't just one thing. It can manifest in many different ways.
So it seems like we're blurring the lines between individuals, colonies, and even entire ecosystems when we start thinking about fitness this way. It's all interconnected.
You got it. And it reminds us that the individual might not always be the most relevant unit of analysis when studying evolution. Sometimes we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
This is all so fascinating. We've gone from survival of the fittest to probabilistic dispositions, from rethinking individuals to questioning what it even means to be fit.
And we're just getting started. Let's bring back the idea of ecological fitness and see how it connects to another important concept.
Drift.
Drift, like drifting through life without a purpose.
Not exactly. In evolutionary terms, drift refers to the role of chance in shaping populations. Imagine you're observing a population and you notice a shift in the ratios of different types of organisms.
Okay, I'm picturing it. What happens next? Well, what if the shift doesn't line up with your predictions based on their fitness differences? It's like something unexpected is happening.
So there's a mismatch between what we expect to see based on our understanding of fitness and what's actually happening in the real world.
Right. And ecological fitness can help us figure out if this unexpected change is due to random drift, or if we've just miscalculated those fitness differences in the first place. Maybe we missed something about how those traits interact with the environment.
So ecological fitness acts like a sort of reality check, helping us figure out if those changes are due to chance or to something else we haven't quite grasped yet.
Precisely. Even in large populations, drift is always playing a role. This is why it's so crucial to understand fitness at the individual level. Those tiny variations and chance events can have huge ripple effects.
Like the butterfly effect, right?
Yep.
One tiny change can lead to something completely unexpected down the line.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying evolution so fascinating and complex.
This deep dive has definitely given me a whole new perspective on survival of the fittest. It's so much more than just a catchy phrase.
Absolutely. It's a concept that continues to challenge our understanding of how life evolves. And all of this talk about fitness brings us back to a really fundamental question.
Hmm.
What exactly is natural selection?
Okay, back to the big picture. I'm ready to have my mind blown again. So how does our understanding of fitness, all these different ways of thinking about it, shape our view of natural selection? How are they connected?
Well, some people would say they're so intertwined that you can't really have one without the other. And this is where things get super interesting because there are some really cool alternative perspectives emerging that challenge that traditional view of natural selection as this driving force, this guiding hand of evolution.
Ooh, paradigm shifts. I love those.
Yeah.
Tell me more about these alternative views.
Okay, so one group of philosophers, and we're talking people like Walsh, Lewins, Ariu, Mathen, they're all suggesting that maybe natural selection is best understood as a description of patterns that we see at the population level, patterns that emerge from processes that aren't inherently selective themselves.
Okay, so instead of natural selection being this active force that's selecting certain traits, it's more like a label we slap on the outcome of other things that are happening at the individual level. Like we observe these patterns and say, oh yeah, that's natural selection at work, but maybe it's not actually a force in itself, more like a consequence.
Exactly, you're getting it. And in that view, fitness kind of loses its power as a cause. It becomes more of a statistical tool for describing those changes we observe, rather than a driving force behind those changes. Just a way to summarize what happened, not to explain why.
That's a pretty big shift from how most people think about natural selection. Makes you wonder if we're all just along for the evolutionary ride.
Right. And there's another camp, too. This one's represented by philosophers like Milstein and Stevens. They argue that fitness A&D, natural selection DO have causal power, but it's at the population level, not the individual level.
So in this view, it's the collective properties of the whole population that are really driving the evolutionary bus, not the actions of all the little individuals running around. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts when it comes to evolution.
Precisely. They're saying that selection pressures act on the entire population, shaping its composition and leading to the success of certain traits over others.
Interesting. So it's not that individual organisms aren't important. It's just that their actions and traits matter more in the context of the whole population.
That's a good way to put it. It's a more holistic perspective.
Okay, so we've got natural selection as a description of other non-selective processes. And we've got natural selection as a causal force at the population level. Is there a third option, some kind of middle ground?
You read my mind. There is a third viewpoint that argues that fitness simply has to be both an individual A&D causal concept if it's going to have any real explanatory power in evolutionary theory.
Okay, so this view brings it back to the individual and says we can't ignore the role of each organism and its unique traits. It's like saying, sure, population level stuff is important, but we need to understand what's happening at the individual level to really see how those bigger patterns emerge.
That's it. This view says that to really explain the incredible diversity and complexity we see in the natural world, we can't just focus on the group. Individual variation, individual interactions with the environment, those are the building blocks of evolution.
So are we saying that all three perspectives are right? Or are we on a quest to find the one true understanding of natural selection? Which philosopher wins the prize?
Well, that's the beauty of philosophy, right? It's not always about finding the one right answer. It's about exploring different ways of thinking, different interpretations, and seeing how they all contribute to a richer, more nuanced understanding. Each of these viewpoints highlights something important about natural selection.
This deep dive is really making me rethink that whole survival of the fittest thing. It's way more complicated than it sounds.
Absolutely. It's a concept that's been debated for like centuries and continues to challenge us to think deeper about the very nature of life itself. Like, what does it even mean to be fit?
Speaking of thinking deeper, I'm curious about the history of all this. Did Darwin himself struggle with these questions about defining fitness? I mean, he was the one who put it on the map.
He did. It's fascinating to see how those early thinkers grappled with these same fundamental issues. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out that Darwin actually had a really tough time defining fitness in a precise way. He recognized how tricky it was. He even admitted that some definitions could end up being circular, like that whole the fittest are the ones who survive problem we talked about.
It's kind of comforting to know that even Darwin wrestled with these same questions. It makes it feel a little less intimidating for the rest of us.
Right. These aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles. They're questions that get to the heart of how we understand life on Earth. And they have real consequences for how we interpret the evidence, how we build scientific theories.
So how did Darwin approach this whole fitness thing? What were his main insights?
Well, Darwin's big focus was on variation, how organisms differ in their traits and how those differences affect their chances of survival and reproduction. He saw that certain traits could give an organism a leg up in certain environments, making them more likely to pass those traits on to their offspring.
So even though he didn't use the exact term ecological fitness, he was already thinking about how an organism's success depends on how well it fits into its environment. He laid the groundwork for all these different ways of thinking about fitness that we're talking about now.
Absolutely. And the Stanford Encyclopedia points out that Darwin's emphasis on variation and adaptation has had a huge impact on how we think about fitness even today.
That's pretty amazing. But I bet his ideas weren't all sunshine and roses, were they? What kind of pushback did he get?
Well, as you might guess, that accusation of circularity, that survival of the fittest is a tautology, was a big one. People were saying, well, you're just defining fitness by survival. It's like saying the ones who survive are the ones who survive. Duh.
Not very helpful.
Nope. And that critique has been a thorn in the side of evolutionary theory ever since. Philosophers and biologists are constantly trying to find ways to define and measure fitness that don't fall into that circularity trap. It's a work in progress, you could say.
Always trying to refine our understanding, get closer to the truth, or at least a better approximation of it. That's science.
Exactly. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge. And this whole deep dive into fitness is a perfect example of how philosophy can help us along the way. It forces us to examine our assumptions, get clear on our concepts, and explore those alternative viewpoints.
It can be a little overwhelming. Honestly, this whole conversation has really stretched my brain. But it's also super inspiring to see how much there is still to learn about the natural world. It never gets boring.
That's the beauty of it. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. But that's exciting, not discouraging. It means there's always more to explore, more mysteries to unravel, more insights to be gained.
Well said. I'm excited to hear what other insights the Stanford Encyclopedia has in store for us. What's next on our fitness adventure?
Welcome back to our deep dive into fitness. We've explored so many different facets of this concept, from the classic problem of defining it to thinking about it as a probabilistic disposition. We even question the very idea of a biological individual.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And you left us with that incredible question about redefining fitness in terms of flourishing. That really got me thinking. What would it mean for an organism or a species or even an entire ecosystem to truly flourish?
It's such a powerful idea, isn't it? It pushes us beyond that basic survival and reproduction framework and makes us consider what a thriving life actually looks like, not just for individuals, but for the whole web of life.
I've been trying to wrap my head around it. It's a big question. Where do we even begin to unpack such a complex concept?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually gives us some interesting starting points. It points out that even within traditional evolutionary theory, there are these hints of a broader understanding of fitness. Remember our discussion of ecological fitness.
Yeah, that idea that it's not just about how many offspring you have, it's about how well you're adapted to your environment, how well your traits match up with the challenges you face, like that key fitting into a lock analogy.
Exactly. And if we take that analogy a step further, we could say that a truly flourishing organism doesn't just survive, it thrives. It contributes to the overall health and stability of the ecosystem. It's like it finds its niche and really excels in it, not just for its own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole.
So it's not just about individual success, it's about being a valuable member of the community, contributing to something larger than yourself.
Precisely. It's about interconnectedness and interdependence. And this resonates with some of those other conceptions of fitness we talked about, like Van Balen's focus on energy control and Bouchard's emphasis on persistence through time.
Right, a flourishing individual or species would probably be one that's really good at managing resources, contributing to the flow of energy through the ecosystem and persisting over long periods.
Exactly. It's all connected. And it makes us think about those amazing symbiotic relationships we see in nature, where different species cooperate for mutual benefit. Could those be seen as examples of flourishing in an evolutionary context?
Totally. Symbiosis shows us that evolution isn't always about competition, that cutthroat survival of the fittest mentality. Cooperation and interdependence can be just as important, maybe even more so, for creating a truly thriving ecosystem.
It's a good reminder that sometimes working together, supporting each other's well-being can be a much more successful strategy in the long run. And it makes you wonder, what would happen if we applied that same philosophy to our own lives, to our relationship with the natural world?
Yeah, what if instead of always trying to dominate and control nature, we focused on finding ways to coexist and thrive together? What would a world that prioritizes flourishing for all beings actually look like?
That's a powerful question to ponder. And it's a question that leads us beyond the realm of science and into the realm of ethics, values, and beliefs. What do we truly value? What kind of world do we want to create?
It's a little daunting, honestly, to think about the scale of those questions, but it's also incredibly exciting. This whole deep dive has been such a mind-expanding experience. It's made me realize just how much there is to learn and how much our perspective can change when we take the time to really dig into these complex ideas.
I'm so glad to hear that. This deep dive wasn't just about understanding fitness, it was about sparking that curiosity, encouraging you to keep questioning and exploring, and I think we've achieved that.
Definitely. I feel like my brain has gotten a serious workout
Well,
in the best possible way.
that's what we like to hear. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay, hit me with it.
If we were to redefine fitness, not just in terms of survival and reproduction, but in terms of flourishing, what would that mean for an organism, a species, or an entire ecosystem? What would that world look like? I think that's something worth reflecting on.
Absolutely. That's a challenge I'm willing to take on. And on that note, I think it's time for us to sign off. But keep those amazing brains of yours working, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.